Jake Morrison never thought his life would end in the cold darkness of space while staring at alien warships that looked like giant crystals floating among the stars. The exploration vessel New Horizon had been his home for 3 years as he and his crew mapped unknown star systems at the edge of human space. Today was supposed to be just another routine survey of the Kepler system, checking planets for resources and making sure no hostile life forms lived there. Instead, Jake found himself watching his crew die, one by one as energy beams tore through the ship's hull like paper. The Zephyrian patrol fleet had appeared without warning, dropping out of faster-than-light travel right on top of them. Jake had heard stories about these aliens from other explorers who had been lucky enough to escape their encounters. The Zephyrians ruled most of the galaxy with their advanced technology and ruthless military force. Their ships were works of art and death, made from some kind of living crystal that could repair itself and fire weapons that no human armor could stop. Captain Danny Walsh had tried to send a distress signal back to Earth before the enemy weapons disabled their communications array. The New Horizon was fast for a human ship, but looked like a slow-moving rock compared to the graceful alien vessels that surrounded them. Jake watched through the bridge windows as beam after beam struck his friends and crewmates. The aliens were not trying to destroy the ship completely, just kill everyone aboard except for one person. They wanted a prisoner. The boarding party came through the airlock like living nightmares. The Zephyrians stood over 7 feet tall with 4 arms and skin that looked like polished metal. Their faces had too many eyes and mouths full of sharp teeth that clicked when they spoke in their strange language. They wore no armor because their natural skin was harder than any metal humans had ever created. Energy weapons floated around them without anyone holding them, controlled by their minds alone. Jake had hidden in the engine room when the boarding began, but there was nowhere to run on a ship in deep space. The aliens found him within minutes, their scanning devices seeing through every wall and door. When they dragged him to the bridge, Jake saw the bodies of his 12 crewmates lying where they had fallen. Danny was still alive but barely breathing, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. The alien leader, whose skin glowed with faint blue light, pointed one of its floating weapons at Danny's head. The creature spoke in perfect English, its voice sounding like metal scraping against stone. It told Jake that his friend would live if Jake came quietly. If he resisted, Danny would die slowly and painfully. Jake looked into Danny's eyes and saw his captain trying to mouth the words telling him to fight, to not give up. But Jake could not watch his friend suffer for his pride. He raised his hands and told the aliens he would go with them. Danny died anyway. The alien leader laughed as its weapon fired, killing Jake's best friend and captain right in front of him. The creatures seemed to find human emotions amusing, like watching pets perform tricks. They put energy shackles on Jake's wrists and ankles that burned his skin whenever he tried to move too quickly. The shackles also did something to his mind, making it hard to think clearly or remember things properly. The journey to the Zephyrian capital world took 2 weeks in human time. Jake spent most of it in a cell that was too small for him to stand up straight, eating food that tasted like metal and drinking water that made him sick. The aliens checked on him every few days, asking questions about human military strength and the location of Earth's colonies. Jake told them nothing, which seemed to amuse them even more. When they finally reached Zephy's prime, Jake got his first look at the heart of the Galactic Empire that had ruled for over 3,000 years. The planet was covered in cities made of the same living crystal as their ships, reaching up into the clouds like impossible towers of light. Millions of different alien species walked the streets, all of them slaves or servants of the Zephyrians. Some looked almost human, while others were so strange that Jake could not understand how they moved or lived. The Imperial Palace sat at the center of the largest city, a massive structure that seemed to grow from the planet itself. Jake was dragged through corridors filled with floating platforms and walls that showed images of conquered worlds. The Zephyrians had defeated every species they had ever encountered, adding their technology and resources to the empire while enslaving or destroying their people. The throne room was the size of a football stadium with a ceiling that showed the stars outside. The High Council sat on platforms of crystal that floated in the air around a central throne where the Emperor would have sat if he had been there. 12 alien beings looked down at Jake like he was an interesting insect they had found. Their leader, High Counselor Vexstar, spoke in that same grinding voice and told Jake that humanity had one choice to make. They could surrender all of their worlds and become slaves of the Empire, or they could be destroyed completely. They had 30 days to decide. Jake looked up at the floating aliens and started laughing. The sound echoed through the vast chamber, confusing the council members who had never heard such a response to their ultimatum. When Vexstar demanded to know why Jake found their threat amusing, Jake smiled and said the words that would start the fall of an empire. He told them they had no idea what they had just started. Dr. Lydia Carter had studied over 40 different alien species during her career as the Empire's chief xenobiologist, but she had never encountered anything quite like the human prisoner. Most captured aliens either cowered in fear when brought before the High Council or raged helplessly against their captors. This human had laughed at them and then smiled as if he knew something they did not. The Council had been disturbed enough by his reaction to assign their best scientists to figure out what made humans different from other species. Lydia's laboratory in the Imperial Science Complex was a place of wonders and horrors, depending on your point of view. She had dissected the bodies and minds of countless beings to understand their strengths and weaknesses for the Empire's military forces. Her work had helped the Zephyrians conquer dozens of worlds by revealing the biological and psychological vulnerabilities of their enemies. Now, she was supposed to do the same thing to this strange creature called Jake Morrison. The human sat in his cell with an attitude that Lydia found fascinating. He was not trying to escape or begging for mercy like most prisoners. Instead, he seemed genuinely curious about everything around him, asking questions about Zephyrian technology and culture as if he was a tourist rather than a captive. When Lydia began her first examination, Jake actually seemed excited to meet her and started asking about her research methods and scientific equipment, unlike her militant colleagues who saw other species as either useful tools or obstacles to be removed. Lydia had always been genuinely interested in understanding how different forms of life developed and survived. Her conversations with Jake quickly became less like interrogations and more like scientific discussions between colleagues. The human had a sharp mind that could grasp complex concepts quickly, but he also had something else that surprised her. He could think in ways that seemed to have no pattern or logic, yet somehow led to effective solutions. Jake began sharing stories of human history that made Lydia increasingly uncomfortable. He told her about wars where humans had been outnumbered 10-1 and still found ways to win. He described how humans had survived ice ages, plagues, natural disasters, and countless other threats that should have destroyed their species completely. Each story revealed the same pattern of humans refusing to accept defeat even when victory seemed impossible. The most disturbing thing, Jake told her, was how humans learned from their failures. The Zephyrians had conquered the galaxy by being stronger and more advanced than everyone else, but Jake explained that humans became stronger by losing battles and then figuring out how to win the next time. He said that every human defeat was really just practice for an eventual victory. When Lydia asked how that was possible, Jake smiled and said that humans were very good at learning from their mistakes because they made so many of them during their third week of daily sessions. Jake began asking Lydia about the Empire's structure and how it maintained control over so many different worlds. She found herself answering his questions without thinking about why he wanted to know. Jake had a way of making conversations feel natural and friendly, even though he was supposed to be her test subject. He seemed genuinely interested in Zephyrian culture and technology, praising their achievements while asking innocent questions about how things worked. Lydia started to realize that Jake was studying her just as much as she was studying him. He remembered every detail of their conversations and somehow used each piece of information to ask better questions the next day. When she mentioned the Empire's communication networks, he wanted to know how messages traveled between star systems. When she described their military organization, he asked about supply lines and command structures. Jake made it seem like simple curiosity, but Lydia began to suspect he was gathering intelligence. The breakthrough moment came when Lydia mentioned that most conquered species had surrendered immediately when they saw the power of Zephyrian technology. She expected Jake to ask about the weapons or ships, but instead he asked why they surrendered so quickly. When Lydia explained that resistance was futile against superior force, Jake nodded thoughtfully and said that humans had a different approach to superior enemies. They studied them until they found weaknesses. Jake then told Lydia about something called asymmetric warfare, where weaker forces used unconventional tactics to defeat stronger opponents. He described how human armies had used guerrilla tactics, sabotage, and psychological warfare to defeat enemies with better weapons and more soldiers. The key was not fighting the enemy's strengths, but finding and attacking their weaknesses. Every army, no matter how powerful, had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by creative thinking. Lydia found herself both fascinated and frightened by these concepts. The Zephyrian Empire had ruled for thousands of years because they were stronger than everyone else. But Jake was describing ways of fighting that did not depend on strength. He talked about patience, creativity, and the willingness to sacrifice short-term gains for long-term victory. These were ideas that no Zephyrian military leader had ever considered because they had never needed to. The conversation that changed everything happened during their fourth week together. Jake had been asking about the daily routines of the Imperial complex and how security systems worked. Lydia had answered casually, thinking he was just curious about his surroundings. Then Jake mentioned something that made her blood run cold. He said that Earth's military had received his ship's final transmission before the Zephyrians captured him. When Lydia asked what that meant, Jake explained that human ships were required to send regular reports back to their home bases. When the New Horizons stopped reporting, Earth would know that something had happened to them. The Zephyrian ultimatum demanding surrender would not be met with fear and submission. Instead, it would be seen as a declaration of war against a species that had spent most of its history fighting wars against itself and had gotten very good at it. Jake told Lydia that humans did not surrender to bullies, no matter how powerful they seemed. The Zephyrian Empire was about to learn what happened when they threatened a species that considered dying in battle to be preferable to living as slaves. He said this with such calm certainty that Lydia realized the human actually believed his people could defeat the most powerful empire in galactic history. For the first time in her career, Lydia Carter began to wonder if the empire might have made a serious mistake. She looked at the human sitting calmly in his cell and saw not a primitive creature from a backward world, but a representative of something the galaxy had never encountered before. Jake Morrison was not afraid because he knew something that the Zephyrians did not understand. Humans fought differently than any other species, and they were very good at war. Admiral Kate Sullivan had been expecting bad news when the communication alert woke her at 3 a.m, but nothing could have prepared her for what she heard. The New Horizon had gone silent in the Kepler system, and now an alien empire was demanding that humanity surrender all of its colonies within 30 days or face complete destruction. As head of the Terran Defense Fleet, Kate had spent the last 5 years preparing for exactly this kind of threat, but she had hoped it would never come. The Zephyrian ultimatum reached Earth through a massive holographic projection that appeared in the sky above every major city on the planet. The alien who delivered the message was clearly not trying to negotiate or discuss terms. High Counselor Vexstar spoke with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been refused anything in his life. He described humans as primitive creatures who should be grateful for the opportunity to serve the Empire rather than be destroyed outright. Kate watched the broadcast from the Emergency Command Center deep beneath the Colorado mountains, surrounded by military leaders from every human colony world. The reaction in the room was immediate and unanimous. Nobody even suggested considering surrender. General Pete Harrison from Mars Colony was the first to speak, saying that humans would rather die fighting than live as slaves. Admiral Nancy Brooks from the Outer Rim territories agreed, adding that her forces were ready to begin operations immediately. The response to the alien ultimatum was broadcast on every human world within 6 hours. President Alan Cooper delivered the message himself, standing in front of the United Earth flag and speaking directly to the camera. He said that humanity rejected the Zephyrian demands completely and would defend itself against any attack. The message was simple and clear, but Kate knew that defiance alone would not be enough to defeat an empire that had conquered most of the galaxy. Kate had been preparing for this moment since the first reports of hostile aliens reached Earth 3 years earlier. The Terran Defense Fleet was small compared to what they would be facing, but it had been designed specifically for asymmetric warfare against technologically superior enemies. Every ship was built for stealth, speed, and hit-and-run tactics, rather than direct confrontation. The human strategy was not to defeat the Zephyrian fleet in open battle, but to make conquest so costly that the Empire would eventually give up. Captain Ben Rodriguez commanded the stealth frigate, Silent Running, one of 12 ships equipped with experimental cloaking technology that human scientists had developed from captured alien debris. His mission was to penetrate deep into Zephyrian territory and gather intelligence about enemy fleet movements and defensive positions. The cloaking systems were untested against Zephyrian sensors, but they were the best chance humanity had of getting close enough to study their enemies. Ben and his crew spent 2 weeks traveling through hyperspace to reach the edge of Zephyrian-controlled space. The journey gave them time to study everything humans knew about the Empire and plan their reconnaissance mission. The aliens controlled over 800 star systems with millions of warships patrolling their borders. Any direct military confrontation would be suicide, but Kate was counting on human creativity to find weaknesses that could be exploited. The first thing Ben discovered was that the Zephyrians were overconfident to the point of carelessness. Their patrol routes were predictable, their security protocols were routine, and they clearly did not expect any serious resistance from the species they had conquered. The Silent Running was able to shadow Zephyrian fleet movements for days without being detected, recording everything about their ships, weapons, and tactics. Meanwhile, Colonel Lisa Park was coordinating with resistance movements on worlds that had been conquered by the Empire. She had made contact with over 30 different alien species that had been enslaved or oppressed by the Zephyrians. Most of them were too frightened to openly rebel, but they were willing to provide intelligence and supplies to anyone brave enough to fight their oppressors. Lisa learned that the Empire's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. The Zephyrians maintained control through absolute technological superiority and fear, but they had never faced organized resistance from multiple species working together. Their military doctrine was based on quick, overwhelming victories followed by occupation forces that relied more on reputation than actual strength to maintain order. The key discovery came from an alien refugee named Crix who had escaped from a Zephyrian labor camp. He told Lisa about something called the Nexus Corps, a central command system that controlled all military operations across the Empire. Every Zephyrian ship, base, and communication network was connected to this system, allowing the Empire to coordinate its vast forces with perfect efficiency. But Crix also revealed that the Nexus Corps was located on the capital world of Zephy's Prime, protected by the Empire's most powerful defenses. Kate realized that the Nexus Corps represented both the Empire's greatest strength and its most vulnerable point. If the system could be damaged or destroyed, the entire Zephyrian military would be paralyzed. But reaching the capital world would require getting past defenses that had never been breached in over 1,000 years. It would need someone who could get close to the target without being detected. Someone the Zephyrians would not suspect. The plan that emerged from these intelligence reports was audacious beyond anything humans had ever attempted. Instead of trying to fight the Empire's military forces directly, they would strike at its heart. But the mission would require incredible sacrifice from someone willing to infiltrate the most secure location in the galaxy with almost no chance of escape. Kate spent days reviewing the intelligence reports and tactical options before she realized that they already had someone in position to attempt the mission. Jake Morrison was being held prisoner on Zephy's Prime, probably in the same complex that housed the Nexus Corps. If he could somehow escape his captors and reach the central command system, he might be able to sabotage it from within. The problem was getting information and equipment to Jake without the Zephyrians detecting it. Kate worked with Dr. Amy Foster, Earth's leading expert in quantum communications, to develop a way to contact their prisoner. Amy had been working on experimental transmission technology that could send signals through dimensional barriers, making them almost impossible to detect or intercept. The quantum communicator was disguised as a small piece of metal debris that could be hidden inside food or other supplies sent to prisoners. Once activated, it would allow Jake to receive messages from Earth and send back intelligence about Zephyrian defenses. The device was so small and used such advanced technology that even the Empire's scanners would not recognize it as a communication system. Getting the communicator to Jake required help from Dr. Lydia Carter, the Zephyrian scientist who was studying him. Lisa had made contact with Lydia through the Alien Resistance Network, discovering that the xenobiologist was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the Empire's brutal methods. Lydia agreed to help deliver the communicator to Jake, not because she supported humanity, but because she believed the Empire had become too cruel and needed to change. When Jake received the quantum communicator hidden in his daily food ration, Kate finally had a direct link to someone inside the heart of the enemy Empire. The plan that followed would require Jake to escape from the most secure prison in the galaxy, infiltrate the Nexus Core facility, and sabotage the command system that controlled the most powerful military force in history. It was an impossible mission that only a human would be crazy enough to attempt. Kate sent Jake the technical specifications for the Nexus Core along with detailed instructions for creating a computer virus that would slowly corrupt the system from within. The virus would not destroy the core immediately, but would gradually introduce errors and delays that would cascade throughout the Empire's military network. By the time the Zephyrians realized what was happening, their entire command structure would be falling apart. The countdown to humanity's most desperate gamble had begun. Jake Morrison had been a prisoner for 6 weeks when the small piece of metal arrived hidden in his daily food ration. To anyone watching, it looked like a random bit of debris that had somehow gotten mixed in with the processed nutrients the Zephyrians fed their captives. But when Jake touched it, the device activated and filled his mind with information that changed everything. Earth had not surrendered, and humanity was preparing to fight back against the Galactic Empire. The quantum communicator was a miracle of human engineering that allowed Jake to receive detailed intelligence about Zephyrian military operations. While sending back information about the capital world's defenses, Dr. Amy Foster had designed it to look like ordinary metal, while containing technology that even the Empire's advanced scanners could not detect. Jake spent hours each night learning about the Nexus Core and how to sabotage it from within. During his daily sessions with Dr. Lydia Carter, Jake began implementing the next phase of his mission. He needed to map the Imperial complex and identify security weaknesses without making Lydia suspicious of his true intentions. Jake started asking innocent questions about the building's layout and daily operations. Claiming he was curious about Zephyrian architecture and social organization, Lydia had become genuinely fond of her human subject over the past month and was happy to answer his questions. She told Jake about the different sections of the complex, the rotation schedules of the security forces, and the various research projects being conducted in the laboratories. Jake memorized every detail while pretending to be fascinated by alien culture and technology. The breakthrough came when Lydia mentioned that the Nexus Core was located directly below her laboratory in the most secure section of the complex. She described it as the technological heart of the Empire, a massive crystalline computer that coordinated military operations across hundreds of star systems. Jake acted impressed by the description while secretly planning how to reach it. Jake learned that the Zephyrians had grown complacent after thousands of years of unchallenged rule. Their security systems were designed to contain powerful alien species with various supernatural abilities, but they had never encountered someone who used basic human skills like lockpicking and social engineering. The Empire's rigid hierarchy and predictable routines created vulnerabilities that Jake could exploit. The most important discovery was that the Nexus Core's security relied entirely on biometric scanners. Keyed to High Council members, the Zephyrians, had no concept of deception or identity theft because their society was built on absolute loyalty and obedience. Jake realized he could potentially gain access by using recordings of council members, voices, and biological samples that Lydia had access to in her laboratory. Jake began his psychological campaign against the Empire by planting seeds of doubt. In every conversation, he challenged Zephyrian assumptions about their superiority and questioned whether their methods were truly effective. When Lydia mentioned that most species surrendered immediately when faced with Imperial force, Jake suggested that this might actually be a weakness rather than a strength. He explained to Lydia that humans had learned the most from fighting enemies who refused to give up easily. Quick victories taught you nothing about your opponent's capabilities or your own limitations. The Zephyrians had become so accustomed to easy wins that they had stopped improving their tactics or technology. They had no experience dealing with enemies who adapted and learned from their mistakes. Jake's most effective weapon was his apparent lack of fear about the Empire's threats. When Lydia asked why he seemed so confident that humanity could resist Zephyrian power, Jake told her that humans had faced extinction many times throughout their history and had always found ways to survive. He said that threatening to destroy humanity was like threatening to destroy cockroaches or bacteria. It just made them stronger and more determined to spread. The psychological impact of these conversations began affecting Lydia's work and her confidence in the Empire. She started questioning whether the Zephyrians really understood the species they conquered, or if they had just been lucky to face opponents who were easily intimidated. Jake's casual certainty that humans would find a way to win made her wonder if the Empire might have made a serious miscalculation. Jake used his quantum communicator to send detailed intelligence back to Earth about the Nexus Core's location, security protocols, and operational schedules. He also transmitted information about Zephyrian military doctrine and the locations of key defensive installations throughout the capital system. This intelligence allowed Admiral Kate Sullivan to plan coordinated attacks that would support Jake's infiltration mission. The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. Jake would escape during the night shift change when security was at its weakest. He would use the ventilation system to reach Lydia's laboratory and steal the biological samples and access codes needed to fool the Nexus Core's security systems. Then he would infiltrate the command center and upload a virus that would slowly corrupt the Empire's military network. Jake spent weeks memorizing the complex's layout and security procedures while gathering the materials he would need for his escape. Lydia unknowingly helped him by allowing him to construct what she thought was a primitive human communication device. In reality, Jake was building tools for lockpicking and electronics manipulation using components from Zephyrian medical equipment. The virus itself was a masterpiece of human programming designed by Dr. Amy Foster and her team. Instead of causing immediate damage that would be quickly detected and repaired, it would introduce subtle errors into the Nexus Core's operations. Military orders would be delayed by minutes or hours, supply shipments would be sent to wrong destinations, and communication between star systems would become increasingly unreliable. The beauty of the virus lay in its ability to mimic natural system decay rather than obvious sabotage. The Zephyrians would waste weeks trying to identify hardware problems while their empire slowly lost the ability to coordinate its vast military forces. By the time they realized the damage was caused by software corruption, the virus would have spread throughout their entire network. Jake's most dangerous moment came when Lydia began to suspect that her human prisoner was not as helpless as he appeared. She had noticed that Jake asked very specific questions about subjects that could help him plan an escape, and his casual confidence about human resistance efforts seemed too genuine to be mere bravado. When she confronted him about her suspicions, Jake had to convince her that he was still just a curious prisoner. He told Lydia that humans naturally tried to understand their environment and circumstances, even when they could not change them. Jake said he asked questions because learning new things helped him cope with the stress of captivity. As for his confidence about human resistance, Jake explained that believing his people would come for him was the only thing that kept him sane in his cell. Lydia wanted to believe Jake's explanations, because she had grown to respect and even like him during their weeks together. But she also knew that if he was planning an escape, she would be held responsible for not preventing it. The conflict between her professional duties and her personal feelings created the opening that Jake needed to complete his mission. The final piece of the plan fell into place when Jake convinced Lydia to let him help with some of her research projects. He claimed that humans had unique perspectives on biological problems that might prove useful to her work. In reality, Jake needed access to Lydia's laboratory equipment and security codes. She agreed to his request, unknowingly giving him everything he needed to infiltrate the heart of the Zephyrian Empire. The escape from his cell was almost insultingly easy, confirming every suspicion Jake had developed about Zephyrian overconfidence during his weeks of captivity. The energy lock that held his door closed was designed to contain aliens with incredible physical strength or supernatural abilities, but it had never been tested against someone who understood basic electronics and had spent his childhood learning to pick locks from his grandfather. Jake used tools made from medical equipment components to bypass the lock's power supply, and the door simply slid open. Jake waited in his cell until the night shift change began at exactly midnight Zephyrian time. The aliens were so rigid in their scheduling that he could predict their movements down to the minute. 2 guards would leave their posts to report to their supervisor, while 2 new guards would arrive 3 minutes later from the opposite direction. That 3-minute window was his only chance to reach the ventilation system without being seen. The corridor outside his cell stretched in both directions, with smooth walls made of the same living crystal as everything else in the Imperial complex. Jake had memorized every detail of the route to Lydia's laboratory during his daily escort trips, counting steps and noting landmarks that would help him navigate in the darkness. The ventilation grills were located every 50 meters along the ceiling, just within reach if he could find something to climb on. Jake used his makeshift tools to remove the screws holding the nearest ventilation grill in place. The Zephyrians had never considered that someone might try to escape through their air circulation system because no prisoner had ever been desperate or crazy enough to attempt it. The ducts were barely large enough for a human to crawl through, but they connected every room in the complex and were completely unmonitored. Sergeant Paul Hayes was monitoring Jake's progress from the silent running, positioned at the edge of the star system with its cloaking device active. The quantum communicator allowed Paul to track Jake's location and provide guidance through the complex's maze-like structure. Paul's job was to coordinate with the infiltration mission while watching for Zephyrian patrol ships that might detect their presence. The journey through the ventilation system took over an hour as Jake crawled through narrow ducts and around massive air processing units. The route to Lydia's laboratory required him to travel through 3 different sections of the complex, each with its own security measures and guard rotations. Jake had to stop several times when patrol groups passed beneath the ducts, waiting in complete silence until they moved on. Lydia's laboratory was located in the research section of the complex, 5 floors above the maximum security area that housed the Nexus core. Jake reached the lab's ventilation grill just as the night shift was settling into their routine patrol patterns. The laboratory was dark except for the soft glow of various alien machines that never stopped working. Jake carefully removed the grill and dropped silently into the room where he had spent so many hours being studied. The biological samples Jake needed were stored in a containment unit that required Lydia's access codes to open. Fortunately, Jake had watched her input the codes dozens of times during their sessions and had memorized the sequence. The samples included genetic material from all 12 High Council members, stored for research purposes that Jake had never bothered to ask about. He carefully extracted small amounts of each sample and sealed them in containers designed for his mission. Jake also needed to access Lydia's computer terminal to copy security protocols and download detailed maps of the lower levels. The Zephyrian computer system was unlike anything humans had ever encountered, but Jake had studied it during his time in the laboratory and understood enough to navigate through the files he needed. The quantum communicator helped by providing translation protocols that Dr. Amy Foster had developed from captured alien technology. The most dangerous part of the infiltration was reaching the Nexus core chamber itself. Jake had to travel down 5 levels through heavily guarded corridors while avoiding security cameras and patrol groups. The service elevators were monitored, but Jake had discovered maintenance shafts that connected different floors of the complex. The shafts were used by automated repair systems and were not designed for organic beings to travel through. Jake spent another hour crawling through maintenance shafts, filled with alien machinery that hummed and clicked with unknown purposes. The quantum communicator guided him through the maze of passages while Paul Hayes tracked his progress from orbit. Several times Jake had to hide inside passages when maintenance robots passed by, their sensors scanning for mechanical problems but not programmed to detect unauthorized humans. The Nexus core chamber was located at the center of the complex's deepest level, surrounded by multiple layers of security barriers and guard stations. Jake emerged from a maintenance shaft directly above the chamber's entrance, giving him a perfect view of the security measures he would have to overcome. The biometric scanners at the entrance were more sophisticated than anything he had encountered before, but Jake was prepared for them. Jake used the genetic samples he had stolen from Lydia's laboratory to fool the DNA scanners at the chamber entrance. The voice recognition system was more challenging, but Jake had recorded High Counselor Vextar's speech patterns during his original interrogation and could mimic them well enough to pass the basic security check. The door to the Nexus core chamber slid open with a soft hiss, admitting him to the technological heart of the Galactic Empire. The Nexus core itself was beyond anything Jake had imagined, a massive crystalline structure that filled the entire chamber with pulsing light and energy. Streams of data flowed through the crystal like rivers of light, carrying information to and from military installations across hundreds of star systems. The chamber hummed with power that Jake could feel in his bones, and he understood that he was looking at one of the most advanced computers ever created. Jake approached the core's primary interface terminal and began the delicate process of uploading Dr. Amy Foster's virus without triggering any security alerts. The human-designed virus was disguised as a routine system maintenance update, complete with proper authorization codes and timestamps. Jake watched nervously as the upload progress bar slowly filled, knowing that discovery at this point would mean certain death and the failure of humanity's only hope. The virus upload completed successfully, and Jake began making his way back toward the chamber exit. The corrupt code was now spreading through the Nexus core's data streams, but it would be hours before the first symptoms became apparent. Jake had accomplished the impossible by infiltrating the most secure facility in the galaxy and planting a weapon that would bring down an empire from within. But as Jake reached the chamber entrance, alarms began sounding throughout the complex. Someone had discovered his escape from the detention level, and security forces were mobilizing to search every section of the Imperial complex. Jake realized that his carefully planned exit route was no longer viable and that he would have to find another way to avoid capture. The hunt for the escaped human prisoner had begun, but Jake Morrison had already planted the seed that would destroy the Zephyrian Empire. The virus was spreading through their military network like a cancer, introducing errors and delays that would cascade throughout their vast command structure. The most powerful empire in galactic history was about to learn what happened when they underestimated the determination and ingenuity of a single human being. Jake Morrison crouched in a maintenance shaft while security forces searched the corridors below him, their alien voices growing more urgent as they realized the scope of his infiltration. The alarms had been sounding for 20 minutes, and soon they would begin checking areas like the ventilation system that they had initially dismissed as impossible escape routes. Jake used his quantum communicator to contact Sergeant Paul Hayes and report that the virus had been successfully uploaded to the Nexus core. The virus that Dr. Amy Foster had designed was already beginning its work, spreading through the Zephyrian military network like a digital plague. The beauty of the program lay in its subtlety and patience. Instead of causing immediate system failures that would be quickly detected and repaired, It introduced tiny errors into routine operations that would grow larger over time. Military orders would be delayed by a few minutes, then by hours. Supply shipments would be sent to wrong destinations. Communication links between star systems would become increasingly unreliable. Paul Hayes received Jake's transmission from his position aboard the Silent, running, and immediately relayed the success signal to Admiral Kate Sullivan on Earth. The human fleet had been waiting in position at key points throughout Zephyrian space, ready to begin coordinated attacks that would take advantage of the chaos Jake's sabotage would create. Kate felt a mixture of relief and dread as she gave the order to begin Phase 2 of the operation. Captain Ben Rodriguez led the first wave of attacks against Zephyrian supply convoys in the outer territories. His task force of stealth frigates struck without warning, destroying cargo ships and communication relays before disappearing back into hyperspace. The aliens tried to respond with their usual overwhelming force, but their orders were arriving late and often contained contradictory information due to the virus corrupting their command network. Colonel Lisa Park coordinated simultaneous uprisings on 12 different worlds where alien resistance movements had been waiting for their chance to strike back against Zephyrian occupation forces. The rebels had been supplied with human weapons and communication equipment through secret networks that had been months in the making. As the Empire's ability to coordinate its responses began breaking down, these local rebellions became impossible to suppress quickly. Meanwhile, Jake was making his way through the Imperial complex toward an exit that Paul Hayes had identified using the silent running sensors. The route required him to reach the complex's outer wall where a maintenance port connected to the city's underground infrastructure. From there, he could potentially escape into the capital city and find a place to hide until human forces could extract him. Dr. Lydia Carter discovered Jake's escape when she arrived at her laboratory for the morning shift and found evidence that someone had accessed her computer terminal and biological storage units. She immediately understood that her human subject had been planning this infiltration for weeks, and that she had unknowingly helped him by providing information about the complex's layout and security procedures. Lydia faced a choice between reporting the break-in immediately or giving Jake more time to complete whatever mission he was attempting. The first signs of system problems began appearing throughout the Zephyrian military network within hours of Jake's sabotage. Fleet commanders reported delays in receiving orders from high command. Supply officers complained that their requisitions were being rejected or misdirected. Communication officers struggled with increasing numbers of dropped connections and garbled transmissions. Each problem seemed minor by itself, but together they created a growing sense of confusion and frustration. High Counselor Vexstar initially dismissed these reports as temporary technical difficulties that would be resolved by their maintenance crews. The Empire's technology had been reliable for thousands of years, and the idea that someone could have sabotaged the Nexus core seemed impossible. But as the problems continued to worsen and spread throughout their network, Vexstar began to suspect that the escaped human prisoner might be responsible. Jake reached the maintenance port that Paul had identified and found himself looking out at the vast crystal city that served as the capital of the Galactic Empire. The streets were filled with millions of alien beings going about their daily lives, unaware that their government's ability to maintain control was rapidly deteriorating. Jake used his tools to open the maintenance port and slipped out into the underground tunnels that carried utilities throughout the city. The escape through the tunnel system took Jake several hours as he followed routes that Paul Hayes mapped using the Silent Running's deep penetration sensors. The tunnels were dark and filled with alien machinery, but they provided a way to move through the city without being detected by security forces that were searching every building and vehicle above ground. Jake's quantum communicator allowed him to stay in contact with Paul throughout the journey. As Jake made his way toward the rendezvous point where Paul would attempt to extract him, the effects of his sabotage continued spreading throughout the Zephyrian Empire. Military units in distant star systems reported that they had lost contact with their command structures. Supply lines that had functioned perfectly for centuries began breaking down as shipments were sent to wrong destinations or never left their departure points. The rigid efficiency that had made the Empire powerful was turning into chaos. Admiral Kate Sullivan coordinated the human response from her command ship as reports poured in from across the galaxy. Captain Ben Rodriguez reported that Zephyrian patrol fleets were responding slowly and ineffectively to human attacks. Colonel Lisa Park confirmed that alien resistance movements were seizing control of key installations on dozens of worlds. The Empire's inability to coordinate its vast military forces was creating opportunities that humans and their allies were exploiting ruthlessly. The extraction of Jake Morrison required precise timing and considerable luck. Paul Hayes brought the silent running down through the planet's atmosphere using maximum stealth protocols while Jake made his way to an abandoned building in the industrial district. The pickup had to be completed before Zephyrian sensors could penetrate the ship's cloaking field and before security forces could track Jake to his location. Jake reached the rendezvous point just as the silent running materialized above the building with its transport beam active. He was pulled aboard the human ship seconds before Zephyrian security forces surrounded the area. Paul immediately engaged the ship's hyperdrive and escaped into the safety of deep space, carrying the human who had accomplished the impossible mission of infiltrating and sabotaging the heart of the Galactic Empire. Dr. Lydia Carter made her decision about reporting Jake's escape when she received word that he had successfully left the planet. Instead of alerting security forces, she chose to quietly destroy the evidence of her cooperation with his mission. Lydia had come to believe that the Empire's brutal methods needed to change, and she hoped that the chaos Jake had created might force her people to find better ways of governing the galaxy. The collapse of the Zephyrian Empire took 6 months to complete, but the process was irreversible once Jake's virus had spread throughout their command network. Military commanders found themselves unable to coordinate responses to the growing number of rebellions. Supply chains broke down completely, as ships carrying essential materials were sent to random destinations. Communication between star systems became so unreliable that many worlds stopped receiving orders from the central government entirely. The final blow came when the Nexus core itself began shutting down critical systems to prevent further damage from the spreading corruption. The Zephyrians tried desperately to repair their command network, but Dr. Amy Foster had designed the virus to be incredibly resistant to removal. Every attempt to clean infected systems just spread the corruption to new areas of the network. Jake Morrison returned to Earth as the hero who had brought down the most powerful empire in galactic history, but he always insisted that the victory belonged to everyone who had fought for freedom. The Zephyrian Empire was replaced by a confederation of independent worlds that cooperated as equals rather than serving a single dominant species. Jake had proven that even the mightiest empire could fall when faced with human determination, creativity, and the refusal to accept defeat. The galaxy would remember how one human prisoner had smiled at his captors and told them they had no idea what they had started. Jake Morrison had kept that promise, showing the universe that humans were indeed very good at war, especially when they were fighting for the freedom of all species to determine their own destiny.